Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Friends, this is the word of God for all of us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. And let us pray. Lord, open our ears, open our hearts, open our minds, that as we meditate on your scriptures and your word is proclaimed, that we might hear with joy what you would say to us this day. Amen. So have you ever lived near a neighbor who was difficult? Or who maybe at least wasn't the neighbor you would have chosen if it was up to you? I know some of you are neighbors, so you're doing a good job of not making eye contact with each other. But maybe you had neighbors who were really standoffish, and you thought, man, if only my neighbors were more friendly. Or maybe you had neighbors who were too friendly, and you thought, man, I wish I had neighbors who would just leave me alone. I know over the span of my life, I have had plenty of times where the neighbors I had were not exactly the neighbors I would have picked if it had been up to me. I've shared before in the space early on in my time here about what it was like growing up next door to the scrumpy old man who was a longtime member of the KKK until he had this conversion experience. And up until that point, he was not the neighbor I would have chosen to have. Around the corner from where I grew up, there were 2 boys who were a little bit younger than I was, and I loved playing with them any chance that I got. The problem was their parents were divorced. And so their mom had custody most of the time, and so they were hardly ever there. And if I had had my way, the neighbors living in that house wouldn't have had parents who were split up so that I could play baseball out in the yard with their kids every single afternoon until the sun made it where we couldn't see the ball anymore. Then there were the college suite mates that my roommate and I did not pick and would not have picked. My sophomore year in college, we lived in these suites, and so we each had our own dorm rooms, but they were conjoined by a bathroom, which oftentimes our suite mates forgot to unlock our bathroom door from their side. And not only that, but usually early Saturday morning, Sunday morning, around 2 or 3 o'clock, we could tell if our suite mates had gotten sick from drinking too much the night before, because we could hear it. Sometimes we could smell it. And if they remembered to unlock the door, sometimes we could even see it. They weren't the neighbors we would have picked. And then there were the neighbors Marissa and I had when we were living in apartments outside of Atlanta, who were not always the ones we would have chosen. There were the ones upstairs from us who were always making all kinds of noise, and who almost actually came really close once to setting our entire building on fire, because they didn't realize that you actually have to remove the dryer lid from the little filter that's in the dryer at least once a year. Maybe even every time you do laundry. And then there was the time in that same apartment complex where Marissa's magnificent, awesome, old Ford Windstar van went up in flames. Now there's a whole other story to this. That'll be in another sermon. But the van went up in flames in our apartment parking lot. And this neighbor walks over and stands beside us as we watch these 8-foot flames shoot up from our van while we wait for the fire truck to show up. And the neighbor pulls out her phone, and she just starts videotaping our burning we cross, whether every single day or even just once in our lives. Neighbors are those people who share the community, who share this world with us. And so when Jesus gave perhaps his most famous teaching that we should love our neighbors as we love ourselves, he wasn't just talking about those people we live next door to. He was talking about neighbors in that larger sense. And if we broaden our definition of neighbors to mean more than just the people we live around, but the people who are throughout our community and even throughout our world, then I imagine that we all have neighbors who are difficult. Neighbors who are difficult to listen to. Neighbors who are difficult to be around. Neighbors who see the world differently than we do, who have different desires for our community and our world and even maybe our church than we do. People who have different backgrounds and cultures. People we might not necessarily dislike, but who we have a difficult time connecting with. And so when we hear Jesus' command to love our neighbor, if you're anything like me, it's tempting to wish that Jesus would just give us neighbors who are easier to love, right? Who are more like me or like you. I was thinking back recently to a quote from the early 2000s, because yes, I was actually alive in the early 2000s. And depending on your political loyalties, a very famous or infamous quote from that time period came from former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. And the quote that had a lot of controversy around it at that time was this. He said, "You go to war with the army you have, not with the army you might wish you had." And again, those words were seen at that time to be very controversial. But what I think isn't controversial is an underlying truth that I think is actually in there. And that truth is that no matter what we might ideally have, we live our lives, we go to work, we go to school, and yes, we even sometimes go to war, only with what we actually have. And what we wish we had, and what we actually have, are not always the same. When it comes to loving our neighbors, Jesus seems to have believed that we as God's people go into ministry not with the neighbors we wish we had, but with the neighbors we actually have, even if those aren't the same. His words and his life demonstrate that no matter who our neighbors are, whether the ones we would have picked or not, that we are called to love them. Jesus didn't teach that we should love the neighbors we wish we had or the neighbors we used to have or the neighbors that are the way we would like for them to be, but rather the neighbors who are our neighbors in reality, the ones who we're around. And this can be really challenging. I think back to my home church, a place I got to visit a few weeks ago. A church that's filled with wonderful people and has done a lot of wonderful ministry. And it's situated in this neighborhood which in the early 1990s, and I was alive in the early 1990s too, started to become less white and more Hispanic. And as those new neighbors moved into that area around our church, if they happened to show up to our church to worship, we would certainly welcome them with open arms. But we didn't exactly go out and reach out to them. At least not in the same kind of ways we had reached out to the people who had lived there before they moved in. As a church, we kind of assumed that because of the cultural and the language differences between us and them, that God would call someone else to be in ministry with those people rather than us. And we never stopped to think that maybe God had placed us in this particular neighborhood at this particular time to be in ministry with these particular people, not as we wish they were, but as they actually were. I think of another church I was once part of, another wonderful church filled with lots of wonderful people who shaped my life in a lot of wonderful ways. And in that church, there were some people who'd been there long enough, 40 or 50 years, that they could remember back in the day when literally hundreds of people lived within walking distance of that church. And on Sunday mornings, just about all of those hundreds of people would walk to church. But over the 40 or 50 years, most of the houses went away. Most of the people who had walked to church either died or they moved away. And in their place moved all of these people who didn't look like we were poorer than we were, and in many cases who were homeless, unlike those of us within the church. And again, we would welcome them with open arms if they happened to show up. The problem was we didn't exactly reach out to them or invite them. It's like we were tepidly waiting to jump wholeheartedly into the love your neighbor and build relationships with your neighbor until our neighbors were more like the neighbors we wanted them to be. As Christians living in the year 2019, our churches are more likely to be surrounded by people who don't have ties to religious institutions like the church. Our homes are more likely to be surrounded by people who don't have ties to the church. These people are busier than they were back in the good old days, and they don't just show up at church because we think they should. People are used to stores being open on Sundays and to soccer games happening on Sundays. Those people are more likely to look and talk less like the people who've been living and worshiping in these areas for a long time. And as individual Christians and collectively as the church, it can be tempting sometimes to longingly wait for that day when we'll have the neighbors we used to have, or that we wish we had, rather than jumping wholeheartedly into building relationships and loving the neighbors we already have. People Jesus has called us to love. Jesus called us to love the neighbors and the community members and even the people we share pews with that we actually have, not the ones we wish we did. And if we ever needed a model of what that looks like, then we don't have any farther to turn than the person whose name we bear as Christians, Christ. One of the most notable things about Jesus' life and ministry is that he spent it around all of the wrong people. Have you ever noticed that? Jesus spent his life around the people who no one else would have hung out with. And yet those were the people who were his neighbors, and so he ministered to them and with them because that's who they were. The 12 people, for instance, he spent most of his time developing as leaders, his 12 disciples. Some of them were fishermen, smelly fishermen. And somebody being a fisherman was a nice way of saying that they couldn't cut it in any other profession, and so they had to settle for their family business, for this job that pretty much anybody in that day could do. They weren't the best and the brightest, and yet Jesus called them. Others were tax collectors, the people who everyone else in town called thieves because they stole from people. They weren't the kind of neighbors anyone would wish to have, and yet Jesus loved them as they were, not as he wished they were. And he devoted much of his ministry to his relationship with them simply because they were the neighbors he actually had. Then there were the other neighbors Jesus had who no one else would have picked. Many of you remember the stories where Jesus ate and drank with sinners. Of course, that was kind of a self-explanatory category of people. But a lot of people forget that he also ate and drank with Pharisees, some of the same religious people who would ultimately conspire to take his life. Time and again, Jesus engaged in lively conversations and relationships with some of the very people who conspired for his downfall. Why would Jesus do that? Because they were his neighbors. Maybe not the ones he would have picked, but the ones that he actually had. And then there were the 10 neighbors Jesus encountered in the story I read earlier. One strike against those neighbors was that they were lepers. That meant that they could have a variety of skin diseases ranging from, bumps all over their body, to even to rashes, to even having the rotting of some of their extremities, like their nose, or the falling out of their hair. Not exactly the kind of people that most people would pick as their neighbor. As you can imagine, those symptoms would have been unpleasant for the person with them, and it would have been unpleasant for people around them. Most of us don't want to spend our time around somebody who's itching and scratching and who has, their nose rotting. And that's why if you look back to the Old Testament, there are passages that talk about how the person with leprosy was supposed to be removed from the community and to go off to this place that was far from those who loved them and far away even from the sight of God, so they could become clean and come back into the community. To be a leper was to be a neighbor that nobody would want. godless enemy, this person who was living in land that was supposed to belong to them. That was the second strike. They weren't the neighbor anybody would have wanted. The third strike against those neighbors was that they were pretty thankless. You remember the story that we heard, Jesus healed 10 of them, but how many came back and said thank you? One. Now, just a show of hands, how many of you like to be surrounded by thankless people? All right, that's what I thought. Good. If you could all raise your hands, you would have completely ruined the sermon. But we don't like being around thankless people. We like it when we do kind things for people and they express gratitude for our generosity and our kindness. If you've ever driven maybe down into downtown Clemson, right, when all the students first get back, or when there's a football game going on, or about to go on, and traffic is bumper to bumper, and you see this poor helpless driver trying to turn out, and you wave to them, and they get excited, and they wave to you, and then they turn, and as they turn, they mouth really big. You can't read my lips, I realize. That makes you feel good, right? You've done something kind, and someone has thanked you. How many of you like it when you're in the same scenario, you see this car struggling to get in, and you think, I'm going to let them in, but before you do that, they go, ah! And squeal right in front of you, never even look at you, never acknowledge that you're there, act like they own the road. Does that make you feel good? No, it doesn't. If we had our choice, we would much rather be surrounded by people who do the than around the people who act like they deserve every inch of the road that we also share with them. Jesus knew, though, that he didn't get to pick who his neighbors were. Jesus didn't get to pick whether they were thankful or thankless. Jesus didn't get to pick whether they were lepers or clean, whether they were Jews or Gentiles, whether they were Israelites or Samaritans, whether they were old or young, men or women. Jesus didn't get to choose that. The only thing he could choose was whether or not he was going to love them as they were, not as he wished they were. And my friends, the same is true for us. No matter what the communities around our homes were once like, no matter what the community around our church was once like, no matter what our world was once like, we can't go back and get the neighbors we used to have. We can't go back and change the neighbors we have to make them more like what we wish they were. All that we can choose is whether we will love them as they are. My friends, as you strive to be in loving relationship with the neighbors you have, you will inevitably encounter people who don't think like you do, who don't talk like you do, who don't look like you do, who might not seem to be the kind of people you would have chosen if it were up to you. Go on and build loving relationships with them anyway. You may wish that you could wait to jump into the love your neighbor as yourself thing until the neighbors we have were more like what we wish they could be. Go on and love them as they are anyway. After all, my friends, are you and I yet the people God would have us be? Completely? No. We're not yet who God would have us be. And yet God has chosen to have a relationship with us. And to love us not as God wishes we were, but as we already are. And so, friends, go forth to be like God. To be like Christ. To love all the neighbors we come into contact with. To build relationships with those neighbors we come in contact with. Whether they're the ones we would have chosen or not. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I invite you to stand as you're able. On the way in for worship today, one of our choir members who will remain nameless said they'll know we are coming by our noise, Yes, they'll know we are coming by our noise. Well, let's sing about how the world we will know we are Christians by our love. Know that you will find yourself surrounded at times by neighbors you would have chosen and by neighbors you wouldn't have. But go forth knowing that God has placed you there because God believes that you can love them as they are. So go in peace.